Hi folks, welcome back to class and happy Tuesday. I'm excited about our discussion today. I did send out an email, so I just wanted to clarify at the start that we're going to do something a little bit different than what was originally posted on the syllabus today, slash what we usually do in lecture. So obviously, usually you spend the most time in lectures listening to these videos and taking notes. There will be this lecture video on Fanon's chapter, The Lived Experience of the Black Man or The Fact of Blackness, depending on what edition you are reading from. Those chapters are titled differently, but I just sent out a clarifying email about that, so hopefully there isn't too much confusion there. Sorry that those things didn't match up. I don't know why between editions they changed the chapter titles, but in any case, that is what this lecture is going to be dedicated to, is unpacking that essay, or that chapter, which is very difficult. So we could spend, I think, a couple of hours talking about it if we wanted to, but that's not what I want to spend the majority of our time doing today. I'm going to go through some of the main key concepts in that essay to try to contextualize what he's discussing for you and make it a little bit easier for you to hopefully understand the major arguments that Fanon is trying to lay out. But I want you to spend the majority of your time today watching a performance, actually. So Sunny Kelly, who is a performer and also a PhD student in the UNC Communication Department, has been doing a one-man play for almost a year, if not more than a year now. I mean, been in development for several years, called The Talk, which is about as a black father, Sonny trying to explain to his children the reality of police violence and the way in which that relates to many of the concepts in performance we've been talking about so far, ways in which it relates to critical ideas in race, and also ways in which it relates to his own personal biography, his own personal experience of growing up as a black individual. So that is what I want you to spend most of your time doing today, is watching that performance. It is really an incredible thing, honestly. It is one of the most moving things that I personally have seen performed in many years, so I highly recommend that you watch it. I mean, it is mandatory, but I do strongly recommend it as a piece of work, and I'm very interested to hear the way in which you react to it. So again, please feel free to write about this in your FAQ posts or in your forums posts. If you have any questions, you can ask them in your FAQs posts. Otherwise, feel free to engage with this in your forums posts. I am very interested to hear your reactions and your responses to what I think is a really great introduction to the relationship between performance and race, or how we go about using performance to interrogate race, to explore race, to educate people on ideas of racial justice and social justice and problematics in society that are structured along racial lines, like the massive problem with police violence that many people are protesting right now. So that is, again, what Sunny's performance sort of takes on. So that's what I want your main focus to be on today. I want you to just be thinking about what is expressed in Sunny's performance in relationship to our discussion of Fanon, which is what the rest of this video is going to be about. All right, so let's get started then talking about the bulk of the essay. Again, I know that this is difficult, so I really want to really just hit the highlights here and give you a framework for which to understand what Fanon is trying to do here and what he is trying to communicate. So you'll notice, or probably did notice when reading the piece, that it's not written in the way that a typical academic piece is written. That is, first of all, it's in a first-person narrative. It is about Fanon's own experiences, questioning his own relationship to his blackness, and feeling intensely the way in which being racialized as a black person has dispossessed him of identity and has put him in this place of oppression. So there's a really strong narrative element here. There's also an engagement with poetry that you'll see running throughout this chapter, where Fanon draws draws on poetry in order to express certain points or make arguments that he might not be able to make otherwise, we might argue. So, in a really interesting and I think provocative way, he juxtaposes poetry or uses poetry to answer philosophy in some cases. And I think it's important for us to consider why he does both of those things. That is the style of the piece that we are considering here. We want to understand what is significant about that style. And I think that when we break down some of the main arguments he makes, that becomes a lot clearer. So that's something that we'll discuss a little bit more, we'll return to in concluding our discussion. But to start out, I just wanted to draw some preliminary connections back to other readings that we've had so far. In particular, I want to emphasize how this use of poetry and narrative is something incredibly performative about Fanon's work. He is trying to express the particularity of his own experience, and he's trying to work through a number of different modes of expression in order to do that, not just representing it through philosophical language or making a direct philosophical argument, but really engaging in a literary and artistic exploration of this problem of race that he's investigating here. So, again, then, we have, I think, a demonstration of the way that many of authors who are important to performance studies enact the types of writing that they're recommending that they advocate for, or enact the type of thought that they advocate for. In this case, Fanon is enacting this personal and nuanced narrative of his own life in order to express the particularity of his own experience. And we'll, again, talk about why that particularity is so important once we cover some of the main concepts here. So we want to start then with the concept of ontology. Ontology is the study of being in philosophy. So when we talk about the ontology of the individual, what we mean is what is the being of that individual? What does it mean for us to exist in the world? What is it we are describing when we say that an individual exists, or a black person exists, or a white person exists? Those are ontological claims, in that we are saying there exists in the world something called a black person and something called a white person. And we're making then an observation about what actually exists or what things are in the world. So the idea here for Fanon is that Black individuals have, through the legacy of racialized oppression, been deprived of an access to their own ontology, or they don't have an understanding of their own being that is not mediated or first passes through white culture. So this is going to be one of his most fundamental arguments, and is a really, really important argument in critical race scholarship more generally. So he starts out by talking then, he gives an example of what happens when you are sitting at your desk and you want to do something. So in his case, it's smoke, but we might say find a pen, because smoking is not cool. So if you want to locate a pen in your desk, Fanon says, or if you want to find your cigarettes, you have an intuitive understanding of yourself as a subject in the way that you relate to objects in the world. So he talks about then how most individuals, and we could debate this, and I think that we ought to maybe debate this at some point, but he says that white individuals, that individuals who are in power, are able to understand their relationship to the world of objects in a way that is natural, that they infer from their own experiences. So the idea being that you grow up, if you are a white person, naturally exploring your environment and learning from your interactions with your environment who you are, what makes you up, what your ontology or being is. What he wants to say is true about Black individuals or Black people in comparison to white individuals is that their perceptions of their own lives, the perceptions of Black individuals' own lives, are mediated through the lives of others, or mediated through the way that white culture and white individuals in particular perceives them. So he says then that every Black individual has two systems of reference then. One is their own metaphysics, which is in this case to say their own intuitive understanding of their being that comes from their natural experiences. And the other one is the way in which white culture imposes an understanding of their being onto them, onto Black individuals. The way in which white culture tells Black individuals how they ought to interpret their own being, how they ought to interpret their own existence, how they ought to act and live in the world. And so in his narrative, he gives the example of a young child on the street pointing at him and saying, "There is the N-word. I am afraid of it." Or him, mommy, "I'm afraid of the threat that this person implies, or this person extends to me." And that idea of the Black individual as frightening, he says, is something that is imposed on Black individuals by white culture. Black individuals do not find themselves threatening. They're like every other individual in the world, but there is a social construction by white culture that Black men in particular are a threat, pose the threat of violence. And we see that, to briefly preview a connections to Sonny's play, all the time in the implicit bias that is demonstrated by police officers, and sometimes the explicit bias that is demonstrated by police officers in their interaction with Black men as opposed to white men, in that Black men are often treated as default violent or default a threat in a way that white people are not by authority, in this case being police officers. So we have then this idea of an experience of your own being, like you might have in your everyday life, and then the imposed experience of who you are that is culturally constructed by the dominant culture, in this case by white culture. So he talks here then about how we should oppose this idea of immediate bodily knowledge versus the mediated historical racial schematics imposed by whiteness. Historical racial schematics, that is, the frameworks for interpreting the being of Black individuals that are imposed by white culture and white power structures. So he says in particular that Black people have an existence that is cut into three, that is tripled. So this is a riff on W.E.B. Du Bois, or is I believe at least, and a riff or a modification of a famous argument by W.E.B. Du Bois that says that the consciousness of the Black individual is a doubled consciousness. That for the Black individual, not only do you have the consciousness of your own being, but you have the way in which white people look at you in your head all the time as an interpretive framework of your own existence. So that's doubling. Fanon talks instead about tripling. And so this is to just take this argument one step further. So he says then that what makes things different, or that moves us beyond this doubling consciousness is into tripling consciousness, is that so you have the body and the physical experiences of the body, and then you have the way in which there's a historical and racial schema imposed on the interpretation of the race of that body. But then he talks about how he also has a responsibility or an identity connection to his ancestors or to his history. So he is responsible for those who have come before him, who are also said to represent Black culture, because he is supposed to, in turn, represent Black culture through his behavior. So this creates then a demand to behave as Black. But the demand to behave as Black in this circumstance comes from two places at once, and this is going to be really important for our foregoing discussion. It first comes from the demand imposed by white culture, and then secondly, it comes from the demand imposed by the idea that in order to effectively perform blackness, in order to live your identity as a black individual, you have to be responsible for the whole culture of blackness. If I go and I do something, for instance, that is criminal in nature. Let's say I go and I rob a liquor store. Nobody is going to say, all white people rob liquor stores. My actions and identity don't stand in for white history and white ancestry, at least in the same way. But if a black individual does this, if an African American robs a liquor store in the United States, that is taken as symptomatic of the entirety of the culture, is interpreted as a representation of blackness, not just a representation of the individual choices of that person. So this is the split then that Fanon is talking about. There is first, the body as it exists in the world. The body as it exists on the bus where it takes up space and is getting judged. That body that has an immediate sensory experience. That's the firstness. The second part of being, then, is the experience of judgment that one imposes on oneself through the language of white culture. So the fear of the little girl being interpreted as, or imposed on oneself as an interpretation that has perhaps not accuracy, but still helps define the identity. And then thirdly, the idea that in order to resist those negative interpretations that are handed down by white culture, one not only has to act for themselves, but has to act for the entirety of black culture. And in that way, the responsibilities of the black individual far outweigh the responsibilities of the white individual, because nothing that the white individual does is taken as a representation of their culture, has that burden put upon it. So this is then the tripling that Fanon talks about at the beginning as a description of both the alienation and from one's own identity and the oppression that black individuals are made to feel underneath the oppression of white culture. The next part of his argument is to engage with a French existentialist philosopher named Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre writes a famous essay on the nature of Jewishness and the way in which Jewish people were oppressed and exterminated during World War II, and the way in which this affected Jewish cultural identity. And so Fanon spends a lot of time creating this parallel between Jewish individuals and black individuals by means of comparing the way in which they are oppressed. And he wants to say that they are both the same and not the same. That what is the same about being black and being Jewish is that there is this interpretation that is forced upon your identity, that in some ways you are meant to, what the psychoanalytic term for this, and he does talk about psychoanalysis a little bit, so just really quickly as a sidebar, psychoanalysis is like early psychology. It is a subfield of psychology that is developed as an independent tradition, starting with Freud in particular. Freud being its most famous representation, and then more contemporarily, we would talk about somebody like Jacques Lacan as being a psychoanalyst. People in more traditional Western psychology do not have a whole lot of scientific respect for psychoanalysis, but it is still a very robust and important field in the humanities and critical thinking. So his discussion of psychoanalysis here comes in a couple of different places, but the reason I introduce it here is that there's a term in psychoanalysis called introjection. And introjection occurs when there is something in society, that society, your parents tell you that you learn through social interaction. So your teacher in the third grade says that you're terrible at math and you must be stupid. So you introject that judgment into yourself. You take it on and see yourself through that frame. You don't have to remember this word. I just think that it's the most precise word for talking about what he is discussing here. He's talking about how people go about internalizing stereotypes, or internalizing judgments, which isn't to say that you necessarily act out those things, but you have the perception of yourself based on those stereotypes somewhere in your head all the time, and that affects your perception of yourself and your perception of the world. So Fanon wants to say then that a way in which being Jewish and being black is similar is this process by which a white culture, and in this case, a white Christian culture, imposes a set of stereotypes onto you, and that in turn you struggle under the weight of the way in which that stereotype makes you view yourself. Even if you don't fully accept it as truthful, it is still a weight that you necessarily struggle under. He also points out, which is something that very much checks out if you look at the development of anti-Semitism and the development of anti-black racism in the West, that those who tend to be anti-black also tend to be anti-Jewish, that those two things are in some ways of a pair. But what he wants to say makes them different, that is, what makes the oppression of Jewish people and the oppression of black people different, is that Jewish people have he calls this overdetermined from the inside. That is, what it is to be Jewish then is to say, because you have this culture, or to be judged as Jewish, what it is to say is because you have this culture, you are like this on the inside. But he argues that for people who are Jewish, although of course they were tracked down and exterminated, there is not a readily identifiable, you are definitely Jewish from the outside thing. It is instead about the culture. So it says then, or the religion. So he's arguing then that you have to identify a Jewish person first if you want to oppress them. But and that means that it is not determined, their identity is not determined by the outside, what they look like on the outside, but what is on the inside. That is, their religious faith or their ideologies, or he talks about the rationality of Judaism. These things are things that are all on the inside. But blackness, as a skin color, what we will call a phenotype, is determined from the outside. It's determined from the outside. That is, again, to say that somebody can simply perceive somebody as being black, oftentimes mistakenly so. And it doesn't matter necessarily from the perspective of the oppressor, because blackness is simply a determination that you make based on somebody's skin color, oftentimes from the vantage point of the oppressor. So his argument then is that the difference between being oppressed because of a religious faith or a cultural or an ethnic tradition is a little bit different than being oppressed for racial reasons, because in the one circumstance, you're talking about a coherent real culture, but also one that is not identifiable if you just pass someone on the street, usually. And on the other hand, you're talking about something that can always be seen, that is always being marked, and therefore that type of oppression can't be avoided or escaped or run from in the same way that an oppression of your internal characteristics can be. And again, he's not saying that it's necessarily worse for one person or another. This isn't some kind of weird comparison of suffering. He's just trying to draw a distinction between the way that these two types of oppression work, that one focuses on what is inside of a person and one focuses on what is on the outside, the skin color of the person. And this is a really important place, I think, for us to consider the way in which blackness has been scientifically and socially constructed. So this is something, an argument that Fanon is making here, and it's a common argument in cultural studies and performance studies and in the critical humanities more generally, which is to say that race is a social construct. Race is a social construct, and race is a social construct that is born particularly out of power relationships. So, for instance, many people will argue that blackness did not exist as we understand it today until the slave trade was originated. That the people who are black, who were living in Africa, who were living in various colonized nations around the world, were only labeled black when they were being colonized, when they were marked as other in relationship relationship to whiteness. So there's a distinction then between what we would call a race, which is literally just your skin color or your phenotypes, and what we would call an ethnicity, which is a cultural heritage or where one comes from, or a national origin. I mean, those things are different. Ethnicity and national origin are different. But those sorts of qualifiers are different than blackness because they actually refer to a real nation or a real culture, whereas many different cultures are labeled black, and many different countries have people or communities or populations who are black and do not belong to the same cultural, ethnic, or national traditions. So blackness is not something then that is a fact. In other words. So this is where the title, The Fact of Blackness, comes from. It's supposed to be somewhat ironic. It is a fact insofar as it is a cultural construction that does real work and real violence in the world, but it is not a fact insofar as it is something that is essentially true. There haven't always been people who are labeled black in the way that we do it today. It is a modern invention of slavery, and it is a modern invention of colonization. And in that invention, a whole just a huge amount of scientific discourse is constructed that works to prove that black people are actually genetically different, are actually especially genetically inferior to white people. That in Fanon's writing works on figuring out how to make black people less black. And in those circumstances, he's saying then that scientific discourse, the language of scientific rationality, has worked to construct blackness and how we understand blackness today through scientific study, but really all it's done is reified or constructed racism over and over and over again, and in fact has absolutely no real scientific basis behind it. So the idea then, he's saying, is that this discourse of scientific rationality, the discourse of science and Western thought, has been used to support racism, is a construction that props up racism. So this is really important then, both because he is arguing that the history of science and of Western rational thought has constructed black people as other and as lesser, and because it reveals then that rationality oftentimes works in favor of oppressors, that what we consider to be rational is oftentimes what is being imposed on us from above as rational, which is not to say that there is no such thing as rationality necessarily, or is not to say that we should be as irrational or could just make up our own truths as we want to, but is to say that what we call rationality, and especially science, racialized science as it existed at the time of Fanon's writing, was an instrument of oppression. And this is the perspective from which many people that we've been reading so far are trying to argue that performance, that poetry, that embracing things that are more process-oriented, spontaneous, and not rational is a necessary supplement or a criticism of or intervenes into a real problem in Western thought, which is that rationality has been used to subordinate people who are deemed irrational. So black individuals, women especially, have been subordinated based on science, which calls them irrational. So he says then that he wants to embrace, or that he was led to embrace, this idea of irrationalism or poetics over the idea of rationalism. He says that in exploring the cultural writings of black individuals, he noticed that, or the historical writings of people from black cultures and African cultures, he finds an idea of black identity that opposes it against rationality in two particular ways. So the first way that he says that we can oppose the black poetic tradition against rationality is because it does not put the body in opposition to the soul. That is, it does not draw a distinction between the body and the intellect. And you can connect this, again, back to the Porter reading from yesterday, or the reading on performatives from yesterday, the Austin reading. In both cases, what we're saying is that there is actually not this distinction that we think about between action and intellect, between body and thought. That if you look at the Black poetic tradition, what you see is a history of treating those two things as unified and not in opposition to each other. So, in other words, the subject object distinction, where you are the subject and the world is something that you master, starts to go away. So, it removes the opposition of the body and the intellect, or the body and the soul, and it also challenges the idea of mastering the world as the fundamental human function and replaces it with being in the world. That is, a sense of unity with the world, a sense of symbiosis with the world. So his argument here then is by leaving behind white rationality, in which we're constructed as subjects and nature is our object to be dominated, if we look to the Black poetic tradition especially, we have this alternative paradigm that we can start to see through, where we can think about, or where Black individuals can think about themselves as being connected to the world and not trying to master the world, but as a fundamental part of the world. So this is then the most optimistic sort of moment in his writing, I think, or in this chapter at least, is a moment in which he says, this is the poetic tradition in which I for a moment began to discover myself, in which I for a moment began to discover myself. But, he says, he is immediately faced by a problem or a disillusionment with this attempt to replace rationality with this irrationalism or poetics as a way of understanding himself. And so what he says, and this is his engagement with Marxism, is that the way in which both white Marxists and a lot of times Black Marxists construct race is something that is for him problematic, So this is one of the more complicated arguments. So we're going to break it down very quickly. So in Marxism, there is an idea called dialectics, and I'm going to return to that in 1 second because my dog's barking. So in Marx, there's an idea called dialectical materialism, or historical materialism. And the idea behind this very simply is that we move through a number of historical stages of development when we look at history. And the way that historical stages resolve themselves is that there is a dialectic opposition. So a dialectic is something that has two sides that are opposed and then can be resolved into something that resolves their contradictions between each other. So that'll be clearer when I give an example. So for instance, he talks about the transition from primitive accumulation to feudalism to capitalism. That's the way in which sort of Marx sees the evolution of history, and then we would finally arrive at the stage of communism. So for Marx, he says, for instance, that when we move from feudalism to capitalism, what happens is that feudalism empowers a group of people, the feudal lords below the king, to profit off of their serfs and accrue their own sort of wealth. But as soon as you let these serf lords accrue their own wealth, they grow powerful, and there becomes a contradiction between the feudal lord's power and the king's power. And eventually, that resolves itself by producing capitalism, because feudalism dissolves into a system in which it is those feudal lords, the capitalist bosses, that then have all the power at once the monarch is deposed. And similarly, he argues that in capitalism, the capitalist bosses depend on the labor of the workers, and that when we move to communism, that's because that power that the workers actually have all the power and the boss depends on them, will eventually be seized, the means of production, by the workers and lead to the new stage of historical development, which is in this case communism. So that's the idea in a really rough crash course of dialectics. You have two historical stages, or two stages that are contradictory, but then their contradictions get resolved when they move to a new historical stage, although that new historical stage is not without its own contradictions, typically. So with that in mind, then, I think that we can better understand his engagement with Marxism and the idea of dialectics here. He says that Black and white Marxists oftentimes treat race as something that is a historical stage that will simply be advanced past. So he thinks then about, or this vision of race relations thinks about blackness as being the negative of white supremacy. That is, blackness would not exist in a world without racism. It is produced by white supremacy, as we've talked about in the production of the slave trade historically. That is when blackness, as we understand it culturally, comes to be. It is something that is produced by white supremacy. This is an argument that a lot of black cultural studies scholars like Raymond Williams and Stuart Hall, we'll read Stuart Hall next week, will continue, or tomorrow rather, will continue to make and much more contemporary writings than Fanon's work is, which was written in the 1950s, I believe. So this was a popular perspective in some ways that Marxism could be applied to race relations in this way, that we can understand race relationships as being produced by this economic system being the slave trade, and that once we overcome the economic system that depends on the subjugation of black individuals, that race as such might no longer be a consequential or a necessary category. But Fanon wants to say that there are a couple of problems with this. So one of the things that he thinks is problematic about this is that everything that we just said a little bit ago about the way in which he identifies black culture with this poetics, this searching, this identification with the world, that if it is true that there is no real thing such as blackness, that it is only constructed by white supremacy, then that discussion of the roots of black culture is in some ways farcical, or is in some ways inaccurate. That what we're actually talking about here is the roots of individual black cultures and not black culture in general. And while that might not be a problem in itself because it is perhaps more empirically accurate, his argument is that the ways in which thinking about this powerful black identity unifying the world, unified with the world, empowered him and made him feel more whole, that goes out the window when you just think about blackness as a negative version of white supremacy or as a product of white supremacy. Because, and this is a really, and the next point here being, which is really important, that it creates a concept of essentialism. So essentialism is the idea that individuals are defined by their essences. So the essence of a black individual in this case would be their blackness. To say that we have an essentialist understanding of blackness is to say that there are certain characteristics that would belong to every black person. He says that, or the argument here is that that type of essentialism is not possible when one understands blackness as being a historical product of white supremacy. But at the same time, that makes it really, really hard for him to connect to this idea of being, what it means for him to be, that he starts out by entertaining, because he can't say, this is what it means for me to be a black person historically, because there are in fact multiple blacknesses, because there are in fact many different ethnicities and cultures that are grouped as black, and they are only grouped as such because of white supremacy. So his argument here then is that Marxism, although it is a compelling theoretical framework, isn't really helpful for understanding race in a couple of ways. The first problem, as we say, is that it robs him of his ability to say, my black identity has historical and cultural meaning beyond the way that white people have produced it. And therefore, he says that it robs him of his self-determination. So his argument in this case is to say that if it is true, according to these Marxists, that blackness will eventually be overcome, and we will no longer we will move into what we might call like a post-racial society, which people have been talking about for a long time and we have never actually arrived into. We might end up somewhere like that because we have overcome the hurdle of white supremacy and racism. That contradiction is naturally resolved, and we've returned to understand ourselves as a unified class of workers, for instance. His argument there then is that the problem here is that in this case, black individuals are just reduced into a part in a historical development that they have no agency or autonomy into or over. So eventually racism will disappear as a historical necessity, but it's not because of anything that anybody does. Is well, I mean, people will have to enact that, but it will happen inevitably. It's not up to Fanon. It's not up to me. It's not up to you. It's something that just will occur by historical necessity. So he says then that the idea that racism might end by this means is actually not at all comforting because it doesn't give him any agency or autonomy. It makes blackness just a product and not something that he can claim or invest in or interrogate. It is something that instead has this natural kind of outcome. So he wants to say then, in concluding, that he concludes essentially in despair. He concludes by narrating this moment of sort of apocalyptic despair because his long quest to find himself, to identify his being outside of the trappings of white thought, has been so difficult and has not given him any easy answers. But it leaves us in a place I think that's really important and really valuable, that the nature of exploring race in relationship to power is one of questioning and invention, that it's about trying to locate new identities, trying to question the reasons things are as they are, and it's about eventually moving into a place of anti-essentialism. That is to say that individuals have their own experience and beings for themselves and are not representative of all black people or all white people. They are only representative of themselves and the decisions they make and the choices they make and their own individual ontologies. That's where we circle back then to the beginning, is that while he ends on this note of desperation, this book is an interrogation, a digging into difficult questions that don't have easy answers. So we want to keep the question open here. And we're going to talk about this a lot more next time when we talk about Stuart Hall's piece, What is the Black in Black Popular Culture? One of the questions that comes out of this piece that Fanon does not provide an easy answer for is what an anti-racist politics looks like, what it would mean to go about trying to reclaim blackness from white supremacy or deny white supremacy by some other means, how one fights the white structure of thought and rationality is something that we will continue to consider as we move forward. But Fanon, I think, through his narrative and through his writing, reflects a lot of what we said about is so important about performance and performance studies. That is, that by expressing the particularity of one's lived experience, the way one suffers underneath these structures that attempt to define them against these scripts that they feel that they have to play out, by performing that suffering, I think Fanon gives us this real inside and provocative and in many ways heart-rending look at racism that might not be, and indeed it seems as if his argument is not capturable in a straightforward philosophical approach, in part because the history of that philosophy and the history of science and the history of psychology is all necessarily articulated to white supremacy. It all comes from white supremacy, especially with the way in which it constructs and considers blackness. So that is where we're going to wrap up for today. I went a little bit above 30 minutes, but Sunny's performance is just about an hour, so you should only have about 2 hours of material to review later on. Please let me know if you have any questions, of course, and otherwise I will talk to you tomorrow. Have a great one.